All right. Hello, everybody. Today is January 13th, 2022. This is our first SIG architecture meeting for the Kubernetes SIG architecture for 2022. And welcome. Happy New Year, everyone. We have actually a pretty good agenda today since the last few meetings was canceled. I guess that's not too much of a surprise. But we'll start with David. He's going to talk about our production readiness survey results. So I guess I need to give you permission to share, huh?
Yes, please. And I'm audible now? Great.
Yes. Give me a minute here, figure this out. All right. You should be able to do it now.
All right. You should be seeing a screen. It has two surveys on it, one on the left, one on the right. Is that what you're seeing? Okay, great.
Yes.
So I'm going to cover, there was a deep dive in this. If you want to look at the PRR meeting recording, we go into it in detail. I'm only going to cover a few highlights here. The 2021 report is on the left, and the 2020 report is on the right, and I'll try to keep them in sync as I go. The first thing that we notice is that our respondents are demographically very similar to what we have. We split them into slightly different categories here, but we effectively get mostly cluster admins responding to this, or people who administer clusters. Maybe they're not cluster admins, but they administer clusters. The other thing that we saw is that the number of clusters under management has gone up significantly. You can see we got a much bigger chunk in the 11 to 100 and also growth in the 100 to 1,000 ranges, which is good. More clusters available, that's good for us. There are a lot of pages here that go into how our versions are split and whether people are using old versions or new versions. You can dig into that later if you want. But one thing that stood out is the reason for why people roll back their versions. Now, yes, the bar is still very long. Some component failed is still the #1 reason why people roll back their clusters, but it used to be over 70% of people who rolled back because a component failed, and now we're actually down to numbers in the 50s, which while not perfect is good-ish. It means that we don't have entire components failing. We do have more space being filled in by things like particular feature fails. Another thing that stood out is the usage of our APIs, and I'm going to go to two different pages here. This page shows us the number of people who enable or allow beta, not enable it. They aren't making a choice, but they allow beta in production. And we can see that we have over 90% of clusters that are running allow usage of beta APIs in production. And this is a problem for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that beta APIs aren't finished. So they'll often evolve as time goes on. Another issue is that it allows sort of trip dependencies to develop, where someone relies on a beta feature. It either changes on its path to GA, or when you promote from beta to GA, you're guaranteed that your manifests need to change. So if you're making use of this, it's something that's going to force you to update and change something later on, no matter what you do. The freeform text, which I don't have displayed here, there are a lot of details in it. Many of the reasons that people listed were, it's just hard to turn off. It's a pain for me to turn off. And so they don't do it. And then one final thing that I'd like to cover is our alpha enablement. This still shocks me, but it also clearly indicates that 30% of clusters turn on some alpha feature in production. What that indicates to me, one, is that they have a lot of confidence in our alpha, but also that if they need a feature, cluster admins are able to identify the feature that they need. They are able to figure out how to turn it on, and they are able to successfully turn it on wherever they need to, right? So that does not appear to be a significant barrier, unless far more people want to turn it on. It seems unlikely. I was actually shocked the number was as high as 30%. So those are the highlights I picked out to share here. I will say that the beta findings about so many clusters having beta turned on and knowing the impact that that can have led me to open a KEP. I opened a KEP today. I was a little delayed in getting it open, but I opened a KEP about the idea of turning beta APIs off by default. And I will just briefly pop it up on the recording. So the number will be here. That is 3137. It's up and open for comment and discussion. I'm happy to answer questions about the survey now. And if there aren't any now, you can get me on Slack.
Did you say you were going to drop links into the agenda notes?
I will go ahead and drop it in there.
All right.
As well.
Thanks.
To the KEP too, to the PR for the KEP too.
I will.
The two surveys. Yeah. Thanks, David.
And was the question in survey only about APIs or also about features?
It was also about features. The KEP is constrained to APIs. So it's possible right now to turn on a feature gate or a beta feature will be on. And that may not cause any churn in the cluster, right? If you turn on a feature gate, there's no guarantee that you're going to have to change something. But if you're using an API, there's a guarantee that you're going to have to change a manifest on disk in order to continue leveraging it. All right, and hopefully
All right.
I'll stop sharing.
Yes, you're stopped sharing. Thank you, David. If nobody has any other questions for David, let's check out the next item on the agenda. And by the way, so we were trying to do those surveys annually. So yes, we're presenting it now, but the data was actually collected back in Q2 of 2021. So we took a little while to process the data, but so probably in another quarter or so, we'll end up sending that out again. And if we can get the data through faster, maybe we'll see if there's been any changes in the last year. All right, 1 second.
You're muted, John. Are you trying to talk?
Yes, I was trying to talk, but apparently when you share, it shares the audio and it turns you on mute. So Wojtek, you are up. Do you need to share? If you do, I should just stop this nonsense from sharing the agenda.
I think I don't need to share unless someone will request it later, but I think I can start without sharing.
I can click, well, yeah, I'm sharing the tab, so I can't. Anyway, go ahead.
So I wanted to bring the proposal that we created as part of reliability working group for discussion. Basically, it's a little bit connected with the production readiness survey that David was presenting. So we are seeing that still people are facing a bunch of reliability related issues in their production clusters. I think we all were debugging a bunch of those for our customers and so on. So we were trying to come up with some proposal, like how we can improve the situation here. I think the first proposal, the first iteration of that is like roughly a year old. And I think based on the feedback that we got back then, like it seemed to be way too strict and way too restrictive. So we were trying to come up with something hopefully more acceptable, I would say. So the link is here in the agenda. I was sharing it like earlier last week, I guess, with this group, and I think also in December or yes, somewhere towards end of last year for the first time. Basically, the proposal is to ensure that we will be able to somehow in a more policy-based way encourage people to work, or ensure that people will not be completely ignoring the reliability related issues. Sorry, I think was there a question or I misheard something?
No, keep going.
Sorry. Yeah. So the proposal that we are or the proposal basically consists of like four phases, which include like test flakiness or reducing this test flakiness, increasing test coverage, addressing some long-standing reliability issues, and investing in some like new reliability-oriented efforts. And what we are saying is that as part of like or reliability working group will come up with a more specific list of like specific items, especially in the like last two categories that we will present to SIG architecture, and we will be able to say that like each SIG should be working within some like defined time frame, whether it will be like 2 releases, 3 releases, or something like that. But probably also depending on like how big the effort would be to actually address that. We don't want to do anything like reliability related release or anything like that because that probably doesn't work that well, and I think we need also something more sustainable, and we also need to ensure that we will be addressing it like constantly and like over a long time of period that we will be focusing on that. I probably don't want to go over the whole policy in details, but I wanted to I guess open it for discussion now, or your potential concerns here, to hear if it's something that you believe is acceptable or it's you have some significant concerns here.
I had a question, Wojtek. In the first proposal, there was a mechanism much like SIG scalability has to sort of reject or revert certain changes. Is that something you have in the latest proposal? Because I think that was a little controversial at the time.
No, we relaxed it. I think we don't want to do anything at the like individual PRs level. What we are saying is that or the enforcement mechanism will be purely on the cap level. So if a given SIG will not be working or will be consistently ignoring like all the reliability related requests, we will at some point in the next release we will reject all the graduations for the features that are working. So they still will be able to commit any code to Kubernetes or anything like that. They will not be able to graduate any they will not be able to introduce new features. They will be able to graduate the existing ones because that improves, in theory at least it improves reliability. So like both or beta to GA graduation will be possible, but they won't be able to introduce a new alpha features nor graduate the alpha to beta features. So it's still like a stick more than a carrot, I would say,
Yeah.
but it's hopefully much less aggressive, I would say.
I see. Okay. Folks have any thoughts on this? Well, I mean, I'll say, I guess, I think it's reasonable to put some constraints. I would hope that our SIGs are responsible enough to not get to that state anyway. But, you know, it's reasonable to have some looming stick, I guess, that we need to protect the reliability of the overall project. It can't be abused, that stick. So
is it the sort of thing where we would want to see that we would look and say, yes, we think this is a good idea, but before we make it enforcing, we would like to see what it would actually clamp down on first, to see if it had any false positives or things we perceived as false positives? Would that help make people comfortable with the idea of doing it?
I mean, to me, nothing we do is, we're not talking about mechanical unchangeable things. It's all a bunch of people agreeing to something, so they can always agree that, know that we can always argue that we disagree that this was a bad idea, whether it's quote enforceable or not. Like it's all just up to us anyway.
Yeah, some sort of trial period where even if we say like we're gonna make it enforcing, but pay attention to what it's enforcing, and if you see something that you think isn't right, like bring it up, and like especially during this initial period, like we're open to adjusting things or accepting things, accepting things if it looks like it was triggering falsely.
Sure, that makes perfect sense. Also, the enforcement really will be on us. It's not that there will be any automation. It will be us who, I'm assuming, like in the end, like it will be SIG approval or yes, no, that we want to block some enhancement or some graduation. So, but yeah, that makes perfect sense what you are saying, Jordan. So I guess my question is like, what is the next step? Should I create like a more transform it more to a KEP format or something like that, and open it for like more formal approval for the SIG?
Yeah, I guess that's the mechanism we have. It's really it's a policy change, but that's the mechanism we have for that as well too. So that makes sense.
Okay, cool, thanks. So I will convert it to KEP. Well, it won't be a typical KEP as you are saying, but I will work on converting it and we'll open it probably like early next week.
Awesome. Okay.
Okay,
Thank
cool.
you.
Thanks a lot.
All right. How are we doing on time here? Okay. Liggett.
Yeah, I started a thread on the mailing list earlier this week, talking specifically about what our deprecation policy says about treatment of stable API versions, and just raising the point that it doesn't actually, the way the policy is written, it doesn't actually make them seem that stable. In practice, we've never removed a stable API version. And I have a hard time imagining us removing an entire stable API version. But what the policy actually says is with, if there was a V2, which HPA just hit V2. So according to the policy, we could deprecate V1 and remove it in a year. Would we? No. And I can't imagine us removing it, but the policy says we can. And so that does a few things. It minimizes the difference between beta and stable APIs in the deprecation policy and makes it look like, oh yeah, I mean, stable APIs aren't that much more stable than beta ones, which does not match reality. But it also just sort of sets the expectation that for developers on Kubernetes that give stuff a year and we can actually remove something pretty significant. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think the pain that we've seen the ecosystem go through when data stuff was removed is like a tiny, tiny fraction of the pain that we would feel if something stable was removed. And so I had proposed basically removing that out and having the default for stable API versions be that they're permanent. And so I hoisted a few of the comments from the thread into the agenda. Several of them centered around like, what do we do with edge cases for this, where there's a particular field or a particular value that we discover is problematic. So that was the PVC reclaim strategy was given as an example. Or a particular element in the unversioned portion of an API. So like the self-link example that Wojtek pointed out. I think the networking team brought up issues with behaviors. So even if the API surface remained the same, if the behavior of a controller backing it was problematic, like the scale issues we saw with endpoints, what are we saying our guarantees are? And then David had just today brought up an example of like a particular V1 API that really doesn't have a future in terms of like a V2 API or continued development, like component status. So what do we do with that? And so I didn't know if we wanted to have like a high bandwidth discussion of any of these things here or continue it in the thread. But I did want to point out the deprecation policy already has like sort of an escape hatch clause at the end where it says like if there's something that's like really hindering progress to the system and is harmful, like we have like this policy is a living document. Like we have the ability to sort of work with SIGs and users and figure out ways to deal with things. So, but what I want to see is a shift in the default. The default currently says deprecate a stable thing and you can remove it in a year. I think the default should be once it's stable, people should not expect it to be removed. So I don't know if people want to chime in with other topics or talk to any of these particular things that came up in the mailing list.
I'll chime in. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that though in one of the somebody mentioned David or somebody mentioned, you know, can we well, with respect to say like the endpoints controller, right? It's not just an API, but it's a separate controller, as I recall, that we actually run and do a lot of extra processing. Like being able to turn those things off and leave it up to the cluster administrator. So like, you know, to decide that they no longer, which we already could do with an API, right? We just decide to no longer support an API or something. And should there be a way to make the default become off at some point, as opposed to the default being on?
David, can you just say your comment?
Oh, sure. If we turned off the endpoint controller, is our cluster still compliant? And would that be a problem for deciding to do that? Because I see a lot of utility in these stable APIs, as these are the stable APIs, and basically you can expect them to work everywhere. And so these edge cases, like component status, they don't work everywhere. So if we remove that, is it still valid?
Well, we can already configure a cluster, any cluster, to not be conformant, right? So like, you're right, that if we switched it the default to off, then it would fall out of, the conformance program says that a given vendor is able to create a cluster that supports all of these behaviors. It doesn't say that every cluster created, individual clusters, like it's a little weaker than that, I guess, to say. So I'm not, that doesn't concern me too much. You could still turn it on. Now there is, your more meta point, right? You're maybe not be so pedantic about it, is that, hey, we've said we've got this set of APIs that works across all of the different vendors. And so, you know, how do we keep in sync that set of APIs and behaviors with what vendors are doing sort of de facto or in practice, I think is more your meta point.
And to be clear on the endpoints topic in particular, right? We have, and since all hypothetical, we could change the behavior, or we could add an option to change the behavior such that it disables the synchronization of endpoints and endpoint slices while still leaving the API intact, right? And then it's conformant if you choose to use it, but nobody's using it by default.
Or keep the API functional. If someone is writing directly to endpoints, keep the endpoint slice syncing going, but take the service pod backing thing where we're hitting scalability limits and say, we're going to turn that off, or we're going to limit it to like 10 backing pods or something. Yeah. So like it might degrade.
Right.
But I think the key, and this came up in a few other places too, like I think the key is that this is an option for the person running the cluster. Like if you're running the cluster and you're hitting scale problems, there's a way for you to like improve your life. If you, to your question about component status, David, like I would be fine with having a way to turn that off for clusters that it doesn't work for their topology. Like for them, it is cruft and it's not in conformance. And I think it'd be fine to be able to turn that off. So it's not misleading and confusing for their users. But I don't see a lot of cost to keeping it, and I don't see a lot of benefit to just dropping it for the clusters where it does work for their topology.
APIs that are consistently sorry, Tim has his hand up.
Sorry, it's stale.
Yeah, APIs that aren't consistently available and don't consistently work seem like a shame to have in stable, right? Like, would this policy be used to do that, or would the basis for like we aren't going to remove this just be I don't want to have to deal with like the few clusters where it works? Like I'm trying to figure out whether the policy would be used to defend that versus.
I think going forward, we wouldn't add an API like that in stable. So if we're looking at backwards looking stuff, like the stuff that is already classified as stable, I don't think we should remove it. If we're looking at what would we promote to stable, a good question would be, is this a widely applicable API? Would this be eligible for conformance? And if the answers to those things are no, then it's a good question to ask, why is this being added?
The connection to conformance is problematic because we already have like good optional features that we can't put into conformance. So the conformance group has, don't bring conformance into this yet, because conformance is unnecessarily limiting the amount of valid stable APIs that we should be able to support, because we don't have a mental mode that allows us to say, and we have a way to have conformant optional APIs. But the core point you were making, Jordan, I agree with, of an API we expose to end users at stable would have a higher bar than it did earlier in the project because of arguments like this. But I don't think it's fair to look at what we would do going forward and say, well, because we wouldn't do this going forward, we would break existing users. I view that as a logical two separate discussions that aren't coupled.
So we've largely focused on like, would we remove an API, like a type or an API version, right? Like, I think it's safe to say that within an API version, we're not going to ever remove a type. Like, we're not going to take component status and say no longer exists any API request in V1, component status will fail, right? It might exist and do nothing, but I don't think we're talking about removing it, right? The question is really, in V2, would we ever get rid of V1? Is that right, Jordan?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And so the further question maybe is, within an API version, are we willing to leave ourselves room to nullify behaviors, right? Like the PVC reclaim stuff. The field still exists. You can still send me YAML that has it, but I'm not going to respect it anymore. Is that okay? I mean, it's a pretty extreme situation, right? Like it should almost never happen except when I screw up. But
did we make the example though that, I mean, is the endpoint slice a reasonable example of a reasonable position in order to avoid breaking behavior is to preserve the behavior in a stable API unless the user opts in to being broken. And the opting into being broken is the justification for that opt-in and supporting the other side of it being disabled is there's a significant benefit to most net users. And then maybe the trade-off would be, what if PVC reclaim was in conformance in a way that, which reasonably, like, there will be features that occasionally will be like, you know, they go to stable, they don't get a lot of use. You could make an argument that just because something isn't widely used is not an argument that we should remove from stable. But then there is there's a valid thing, which is if we could know with certainty it was not being used, it might be worth it. But we will never know with certainty who's impacted, and the cost of an impact of removing something fundamental to someone's workload is very high.
And we have other existence proofs of that, right? Like external IPs and stuff like that, where we've added options to block the usage of those features because they're just bad, but we're not going to get rid of them because we simply cannot know that they're not in use.
That was a good example of like, if you're talking about policy, like who can write what to the API, you can already set up a webhook, admission webhook that will block certain values or certain things. It's the key is that the API itself is still there and is still possible to write to. So if the reasons for removing access to this thing don't apply to you, you can continue to plumb data through those fields. And so it really puts control in the cluster operator or cluster owner's hands in terms of like, what does your use case dictate?
Yeah. The flip side of that, there was a lot of complexity to get like good behavior, right? It's like, how do we evolve towards secure by default, safe by default, not stupid by default?
Those are good questions. I think they are somewhat orthogonal to should the API endpoints and fields continue to be available.
I'm +1 on the proposal overall.
Is there anything we can learn from others in the ecosystem, Jordan? We didn't really talk about like Linux syscalls or other patterns of API stability that we might be relevant as exemplars of long-running successful evolved systems. Is that as part of the CAP or part of the proposal, there should be we do some more effort, maybe like through reliability or other efforts to look at long-term maintenance of this, but we don't have to do it as part of this statement?
Let me think about that. I'm not sure.
Okay, any other last comments or shall we move on?
I'll try to summarize some of the points that were raised here back into the thread and either come up, I'm not sure if this will be a CAP or just a update to the proposed update to the policy that we get reviewed. I'll think about that.
I think a proposed update is fine. Okay, Tim, your hand's still up. Is Hippie here?
Hippie is here.
Hello.
Quick update from the Conformance sub-project. We had some early wins for 124 with 12 proxy endpoints. Thank you everyone who was a part of that. And we're excited to get that win early in the year. We have also had the HPI endpoints, which mentioned earlier, that are currently ineligible. At some point, we'll need to do a framework, as was mentioned earlier on the call as well, for things that are optional, but it would be nice to know if it's supported by your provider. We are getting very close to 90 here with 87.25% of endpoints conformance tested with 51 remaining endpoints. Yay. Hopefully we'll have a big party. Maybe in person or no, we'll see. So in Detroit anyhow. So that's our update from the Conformance sub-project. Any questions or thoughts or things you'd like to see there? Secondly, it's been on the agenda for a while. We've kind of been pushing it off due to meetings being canceled or the meetings running long. But should we donate API Snoop to the Kubernetes community, as we discussed back in October, rather than it being a CNCF, basically II team thing? There's two components that are important here. One is the gates for the informing jobs, so that SIG release gets a signal when somebody starts to promote a stable API that doesn't have matching conformance test. And I think that's the primary piece where API Snoop comes into play, that's directly Kubernetes community impacting, versus the flip side where we have some automation in play for when cloud providers submit their Sonoboy test results, and we say, you're missing a few of our important and maybe sometimes optional, where we can say, here's the number of services that you offer as we progress that. So to be clear, I think that second part's not as important from a Kubernetes community perspective, but it might be better overall if the gating and the jobs and things are owned by the Kubernetes community versus CNCF.
So currently I guess my question would be, one is who would own it, which SIG? Two is, so there's one aspect is the code. Another aspect is the sort of operation of API Snoop, the website, all of that stuff. I don't know that is that seems like part of the CNCF portion of the conformance project, as opposed to the SIG architecture part that owns conformance. That makes sense.
Absolutely.
So you're talking about the code, or you're talking about the service?
So I think the things that should be owned by the Kubernetes community are the jobs, and the jobs aren't a website, right? However, I think we pull directly from the repository for the updated list of the data to drive it, coming from a job. So basically the website is fed from a job that's run by the community, so that the definition of what's actually accurately tested versus where the API sits, the status and health of the API is published as an output of API Snoop from the conformance test runs, which combines the state of the current API with all the conformance tests. When they're combined, what is that? And I think it's a JSON output when we're done. So it's easily consumable, but that process needs to be curated by either SIG Arch or SIG testing, I think. Maybe SIG release. I don't know. I think the expertise probably lies more closely with as far as the infrastructure part on the jobs, Kate's Infra Working Group, or SIG testing.
But the website itself, you're not suggesting that would be run?
No. The website is, to be honest, the website's static and it pulls from that JSON file, so it doesn't matter. It's not hard.
Right. Was there a link? Did you have details like which SIG or what was the outcome of? I wasn't in this SIG infra discussion.
I think we just tabled it. Rian, do you remember specifically any details coming to bat? You're soft muted. Still muted.
Yeah, so I can't hear him.
I don't remember any particular detail. I think it was just pushed out due to time.
I guess.
And I think it's.
So what I'm saying is I think that it's pieces of code we need as part of the conformance program, but I don't want to take on sort of operational responsibility. I don't want the community to do that because I believe that the way we've set it up is that that's the CNCF's responsibility to run that program. So I just want to make sure that we're not. Right?
This is so. How do we inform the CNCF of what is for what's the coverage is, right? And I think that's the thing is currently the coverage is owned by the CNCF and the thing, if we separate that out where what is the health of our testing versus our API. That whole piece, I think, needs to be separated out so that our community knows what's defined. And the handover is when we have what's defined is in part of the website and the verification of submitted results.
Right.
And
so I guess, is that written up somewhere already, or?
No, this was more of
Okay.
getting the conversation back up and running and saying, where do we want this to
Okay.
go?
I mean, I'm open to that as long as we get those details about what.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll
Yeah.
swing that back around and put it to the mailing list then.
Yeah, well, also like I think we need a proposal, right, that says which SIG would own which bits and which.
What
with more
outside of an
details,
email
right?
to the mailing list, what would that look like if putting a proposal? Is that a KEP? Is it a ticket? I'm just trying to figure what's the interface.
Just a ticket for now is probably fine. Yeah.
Okay, we'll do a ticket.
Thanks. I don't think it's a KEP level thing, personally. All right. Let's see. Poly. How much time do we have left? 15 minutes.
Patrick, are you here?
He's logged in.
There, he came off mute.
Yep, he's mute. We're not hearing you, Patrick. It doesn't show you as muted in Zoom, so it's something on your side.
I can actually start speaking to it. I'm
Okay.
at the top. This stems from the component base component config work that happened over the last few years and kind of petered out. But a few of the common configuration structs did get defined in the component base repo. I think around things like logging and debug options and maybe client configuration. There are a few sort of struct fragments that are intended to be embedded into config file types for particular components. The issue is that all of the component base config structs are in a v1 alpha 1 package, but they are embedded. The versioning of those structs is not exposed to users in any way. The versioning depends entirely on the consuming component. So kubelet config is at beta, scheduler config is at beta, API server config is still at alpha, but from a user's perspective, all they know is my kubelet config is like a beta config file. The fact that the logging struct under that comes from an alpha package does not matter to them at all. And so it's kind of, the current situation is just kind of strange. It's not really clear what benefit we're getting from like versioning these common component-based config structs. So we're trying to figure out what to do with that, whether to have like alpha and beta packages, and then say like consuming components should just pull from a level that matches their stability level, or if we should just say, these are small enough config structs, there's like 3 fields in each one. Let's just think carefully about this and then say it's like treated as stable. Like we're not really sure what to do. So Patrick can edit it here. Anything else you wanted to add, Patrick? I saw you went back on mute. I'm sorry if you were trying to talk. Well, while we're waiting for Patrick, Tim or Clayton or David or other people who are familiar with config APIs, any gut reactions to that issue?
I dislike the logging configuration being in the config files in the first place. Like, I know we're sort of anti-flag, but they feel like the sort of thing that are supposed to be flags.
Okay, so maybe we agree. We actually hit an issue where if the flag that says what config file to parse can't be parsed, you don't know how to log the error about not being able to load it because you haven't loaded logging information yet. So maybe I agree with you for logging configuration, but I think Patrick's point is well taken that this is kind of a broader issue for like any of these little shared reusable config structs. So maybe set logging aside and we'll think about.
I'm also down on reusing struct overall. Like I started on a mini mission and then ran out of time of like reusing the entire API surface. It just always ends up in pain.
And so the pitch would be just create separate structs for everyone and hope that they end up staying the same.
We can define norms, but yes, they are independent binaries with perhaps different needs. You know, I don't know. Logs is a weird one. It's weirder than the API.
Well,
in the API, I think copying is the norm. Yeah.
Well, sure. Let's say not logs. What if we did it for serving rules, right? Because we have certificates and ports and what you're gonna and bind addresses, like all those things. And I'm thinking to myself, like, if I'm a cluster admin and they aren't all the same, and so like I configure slightly different structs for the kubelet than I do for the kube controller manager, than I do for the scheduler, than I do for the QAPI server, I don't think I will thank future us.
Tim, the reason this the common struct seems useful is that these are actually wiring up to the same component. Like leader election is a good example. Wojtek just added that. Like there's a single leader election component, and the options for that should be uniform across all consumers of that component in the same Kubernetes release. Like it would be maddening if the scheduler options were not the same as the kube controller manager options, were not the same as, I don't know, kubelet options or whatever. Like it seems wrong to have a single component that has options and then not reuse the
I'll walk my opinion back then. Sure. Yes, they feel like within a release they probably should all be consistent. I still don't like them in a file though.
Yeah.
But Jordan, if those actually go with those components, why are the configuration pieces not also going along with those components? Because any change, you're not going to change that struct unless you're changing something about the underlying subcomponent that's using it. Like it sounds like they're in a separate package somewhere that's like evolving separately because it was done by the component config group as opposed to by the component config group providing a library or a framework or practices for the individual leader election and whatever pieces of code owners to create their own structs. Like why isn't version the same as those pieces of code?
Well, I mean, maybe it could be, but whether the versioning is associated with the component or this component-based thing, neither of those are going to be visible to the end user. Like the end user's perspective is, I've got a v1 beta 1 kubelet config, and then like some substanza of that is these options for this leader election or whatever. And so versioning my leader election options inside my versioned kubelet config file is super weird.
Well, it's meaningless to the user because the user doesn't control whether you compile which version of that you compile, right? So, yeah.
So I think the question mostly is, how do we make this make sense to a user? And then that's the thing I care about the most, actually. Like if I'm using what I think is a stable config file, everything in that file should be stable. But then the second question is, say you've got a stable config file. How do we manage options to these components that are experimental? So a good example is like the sanitization, log sanitization. Like that was an alpha thing that instrumentation worked on for a while and turns out didn't pan out, so it's going to be removed. Like that was driven by a field under logging options. Normally what we would do is have like alpha options, and then once the whole thing is solidified, we promote it, but that gets really hard to do.
Can you hear me? Still
yeah,
not? Oh, I have no idea. I think the gain on my microphone was turned down by something, and I have no idea. I just came out of a Zoom conference. Everything was working fine. I joined the next one, and boom.
Yeah,
anyway, Good. I missed some of the discussion because I was also restarting Zoom. So I agree. The current situation, so the current setup with this version A structure is just weird. I think I understand the original purpose. It would have been useful if we had a v1 alpha kubelet config, which uses a v1 alpha logging configuration, and then we have some options only in those structs, and everything is consistent. But that's just not how this thing has been used. And I think a cleaner solution nowadays is to just accept that we have these embedded configs which don't have versioning, and that's just attach sufficient information to the user to individual fields, saying this field is alpha or experimental, whatever we want to call it, in the documentation, and move on, and just have one struct that is the same in all configs that it gets embedded in. And that's what the PR that I created implements. It just basically undoes all this complicated design that doesn't bring us anything, and just has one struct which is treated as an API. So we need to be careful when making changes to it, because it does get embedded elsewhere. But I think it's a cleaner solution. One thing that is not in the PR is feature gates, and there has been a discussion whether that is useful for, I think, a command line object or for something somewhere else. And I think the conclusion was that, yeah, it would be nice to have something like a feature gate that says, I want to disable experimental features. I want to be sure that I'm using just stable things also in my command line. So I could imagine that it would be useful to have, say, a feature gate experimental logging or alpha beta logging. We would need to agree on a name for those. And then depending on what feature and functionality is considered beta or alpha, there would be an error if someone tries to use that without that feature gate enabled. But that's perhaps too complicated. Perhaps we don't even need that. It's just a thought that I had.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. We're just about out of time, so and we're not going to solve any problems here. So it looks like in the agenda, it looks like you have a link to the PR. So please, folks, if you have comments, thoughts, ideas, criticisms, go ahead and go there. And I wanted to we have one more agenda item. James from the release team, I think, wants to say hello. So James, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Nodding. Cool. So yeah, hi. My name is James. I'm the release team lead for Kubernetes 124. I just wanted to come by and say hello, really, as I'm doing to every SIG. I was going to say that SIG architecture generally does not submit caps, but maybe you will with 3136. So at the risk of telling you all things that you already know, the PRR soft freeze on the 27th of January and enhancements freeze itself is either on the 3rd or 4th of February, depending on your time zone. So those are the deadlines to think of if you are submitting caps or if you know the SIGs are submitting caps. I just really wanted to ask if anyone had any questions about the release or if I can help in any way with how things are going.
All right, well, thank you, James. Looking forward to the next release. So, okay, everybody. Well, we're just down to a minute left. So unless anybody has any other quick questions, we'll let it go and we'll see you all in 2 weeks. All right, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See you.
Take care.